Welcome to Mystic Sleep Tales, where the gaslight guides you to sleep. Thank you for being here tonight. Whether this is your first time listening, or you have returned once again, you are most welcome. If you enjoy these stories, and they help you find rest, you are welcome to subscribe. It is never expected, but it is always appreciated. And if you would like to leave a comment, I would love to know, where are you listening from tonight? It is one of my favorite things, imagining these quiet stories drifting across the world, finding their way to different rooms, different pillows, different corners of the night. Now, let us begin. Before the story begins, let us take a moment to settle. Close your eyes if they are not already closed. Let the weight of the day rest somewhere beside you, not gone. Simply set down for now, the way one might set a heavy book on a bedside table before turning out the lamp. Take a slow breath in through your nose. Hold it gently at the top, just for a moment, the way a leaf pauses at the highest point of a breeze before drifting down. And now, release it slowly. Let the air carry with it whatever tension has been living in your shoulders, your jaw, the small muscles around your eyes. Once more, breathe in, slowly, as though drawing the scent of dried lavender from a glass jar on a wooden shelf. And breathe out, long and even. Feel yourself growing heavier, warmer, more still. Good. You do not need to follow every word tonight. The story will carry itself. All you need to do is listen, and let the night settle gently around you. And now, our story begins. The knocking came at 20 minutes past midnight, which was precisely the hour Agnes Whitmore had stopped believing anyone would come. She had been sitting in the back room of the Apothecary, the one her mother had always called the still room, though it served now as equal parts laboratory, library, and the place where Agnes took her late supper when she could not bring herself to climb the narrow stairs to the flat above. The oil lamp on the workbench was turned low, casting a pool of amber light across the scarred oak surface, across the mortar and pestle she had not yet cleaned, across the open pages of her mother's remedy book, that leather-bound volume with its cracked spine and its smell of camphor and secrets. She had been reading the last pages again. She did this most evenings now, the way one might return to a conversation that ended too abruptly, hoping to find a sentence that had been missed, a word that would make the silence that followed less absolute. The knocking came again. 3 deliberate strikes against the front door. Not the frantic hammering of someone in medical distress, nor the timid tap of a late-night customer, embarrassed by the hour. These were the knocks of a person who had come a long way and was prepared to wait. Agnes set down her teacup. She looked at the door that separated the still room from the shop, and beyond it, the front door with its frosted glass panel, through which she could see nothing but the faint orange glow of the street lamp on Croft Lane. She was not frightened. That was the peculiar thing she would remember later. A woman alone, past midnight, in a shop full of tinctures and compounds, and enough laudanum to put half of Thornfield to sleep. She should have been frightened. But the knocking had a quality to it, a patience, that made fear feel like the wrong response. She crossed the shop floor, passing the familiar shelves with their rows of brown glass bottles, each one labelled in her mother's elegant copper plate. Tincture of valerian, elderflower cordial, essence of meadowsweet. The names were a kind of geography, a map of the moors and hedgerows, rendered in glass and ink. Agnes had memorized them all by the age of 12, could identify each preparation by smell alone, could recite the dosage and application of every remedy on these shelves, except the ones in the back of the book, the ones her mother had never explained. She unlatched the door. The man standing on the step was perhaps 60, perhaps older. It was difficult to tell in the gaslight. He wore a dark wool coat dusted with the fine rain that had been falling since dusk, and he held his hat in both hands in the manner of someone entering a church. His face was narrow, weathered, with the deep-set eyes of a person who had spent a great deal of time looking at things from a considerable distance. He looked at Agnes. She looked at him. And then he said a name she had not heard spoken aloud in 7 years. "Eleanor Whitmore," he said, not as a question, as a fact. He was confirming against some internal record. "I have come for the remedy she prepared, the one that was never collected." Agnes felt something shift behind her ribs, a small, precise displacement, like a key turning in a lock she had not known was there. "Eleanor Whitmore was my mother," she said. "She passed away 7 years ago." The man's expression did not change. He nodded once, as though this information, while regrettable, did not fundamentally alter the purpose of his visit. "I know," he said. "I am sorry for your loss, but the remedy, I believe, is still here." To understand what happened next, it is necessary to understand the apothecary itself, and the woman who had built it, and the town that had grown so accustomed to its presence that most people could not remember a time before it existed. Thornfield sat in the crease of a Yorkshire valley like a coin that had fallen between sofa cushions and been forgotten. It was not a large town, nor a particularly remarkable one. It had a church with a square tower, a market cross that had lost its top in a storm 30 years prior, and never had it replaced, 2 public houses that pretended to be rivals but were in fact owned by the same family, and a railway station that served 2 trains daily, one going east toward York and one returning from it. As though the railway itself could not quite commit to taking people very far, the apothecary occupied a narrow building on Croft Lane, wedged between the tobacconist and the premises of Mr. Hargrave, solicitor, whose brass nameplate had been polished so many times that the letters had begun to disappear, as though the law itself was slowly becoming invisible. The apothecary's own sign was hand-painted, dark green with gold lettering that read, "Whitmore, Apothecary, Est, 1851." The paint had been refreshed twice in Agnes's memory, most recently by Agnes herself, standing on a step-ladder in the April rain, with a pot of gold paint and a determination that surprised even her. Inside, the shop was a world unto itself. The front room was narrow but deep, with a counter of dark walnut running its length and shelves rising to the ceiling on both sides. Every shelf held bottles, dozens and dozens of them, brown and green and blue, some clear, some amber, each wearing a handwritten label like a name tag at a gathering where everyone already knew one another. The air smelled of dried chamomile and beeswax, and something faintly mineral like clean stone after rain. A bell hung above the door, but it had been muffled years ago with a strip of felt so that it announced arrivals with a soft thud rather than a ring, because Eleanor Whitmore had believed that people who came to an apothecary were often not feeling well, and a sharp bell was no way to greet someone in distress. Beyond the shop lay the still room, and beyond that the small walled garden where Eleanor had grown everything she could not forage from the moors: lavender and rosemary, feverfew and comfrey, lemon balm that sprawled across the path with the cheerful disregard of a plant that knows it is useful and therefore forgiven. Agnes maintained the garden now with the same quiet diligence she brought to everything, though she would be the first to admit that her mother's hands had possessed a sympathy with growing things that her own did not. Under Agnes, the garden produced. Under Eleanor, it had thrived. Eleanor Whitmore had arrived in Thornfield in 1851, a young woman of 23 with a leather case full of botanical knowledge, a small inheritance from an aunt in Harrogate, and a particular kind of stubbornness that Yorkshire people recognized as one of their own, even when it arrived from elsewhere. She had opened the Apothecary against the advice of Dr. Marsh, who considered herbalism a step above superstition and a step below proper medicine, and against the expectations of the town, which had not previously considered that a woman alone might run a business that involved both chemistry and commerce. Eleanor had proven them wrong in the way she did most things, quietly, methodically, and with results that were difficult to argue with. Her cough syrup worked, her sleeping draughts were gentle and reliable, her burn salve healed without scarring. Her remedy for infant colic had, by several accounts, saved at least one marriage and possibly two. Over the years, the apothecary had become as essential to Thornfield as the church or the post office, and considerably more visited than either. And at the heart of it all was the remedy book. Every apothecary kept records. This was standard practice, expected by custom and, increasingly, by law. But Eleanor's remedy book was something more than a professional ledger. It was a work of accumulated attention, a document that had grown page by page over nearly 4 decades into something that Agnes had never been able to fully categorize. The first half of the book was straightforward enough: recipes for preparations, indexed by ailment, dosages adjusted over the years as Eleanor refined her methods, seasonal notes on when to harvest, how to dry which plants lost their potency if stored too long, margin annotations in different inks, recording modifications and observations. Try half dose for children under 6. Stronger infusion needed in winter months. Mrs. Fenton reports improvement after 3 days. Continue at current strength. This was the book Agnes had inherited and used daily. She knew these pages the way a pianist knows the keys, by touch, by instinct, by the accumulated memory of 10,000 repetitions. But then there was the second half. The second half of the book was different. The handwriting changed, becoming smaller, more compressed, as though Eleanor had been trying to fit more meaning into less space. The recipes were still there, but they were interlaced with passages that were not recipes at all. They were observations, notes about people, descriptions of conversations, of gestures, of the particular way someone held their hands when they were telling the truth, and the different way they held them when they were not, and alongside each observation, a name and a date, and alongside each name, a remedy, but not the kind dispensed in brown glass bottles. These remedies were different. They were instructions, of a sort, but they read more like prescriptions for living, small interventions, tiny adjustments to the fabric of daily life that Eleanor had evidently believed would heal something that no tincture could reach. Agnes had discovered the second half of the book 3 years after her mother's death, on a February evening when grief had driven her to read the familiar pages again, searching for comfort in her mother's handwriting. She had turned past the section on respiratory ailments, past the chapter on digestive complaints, and found herself in territory she had never explored. Pages she had assumed were blank. Pages that were not blank at all. She had been reading them ever since. Every evening, a few pages, like learning a language, 1 sentence at a time. And the more she read, the less she understood, and the more she needed to understand. The last entry in the book was dated November the 3rd, 1882. 7 years ago, 3 weeks before Eleanor died. It contained a name, a remedy, and a notation that Agnes had read perhaps 100 times without comprehending. Prepared but not collected. He will come when he is ready. The remedy will keep. The name beside this entry was Thomas Ashworth, Agnes's father, a man she had never met. Agnes let the man in. This was, she would reflect later, either an act of considerable courage or considerable foolishness, and she was never entirely certain which. But the rain was heavier now, and the man was old, and there was something in the way he stood on the threshold, not presuming to enter, simply waiting, that reminded her of the way certain patients stood at the counter when they needed something they could not bring themselves to ask for. She led him through the darkened shop to the still room, where the lamp still burned and her half-finished supper sat on its tray. She cleared a space at the workbench and offered him a chair, and he sat with the careful movements of someone whose joints had been registering complaints for some years. "Tea?" she asked, because she was her mother's daughter, and her mother had believed that no conversation of importance should begin without tea. "Thank you," he said. "Yes." She made it, chamomile with a measure of honey, the same blend she made for herself on nights when sleep was reluctant. She set the cup before him and sat across the workbench, the remedy book between them like a border neither had yet agreed to cross. "You knew my mother," Agnes said. "It was not a question." "I did." He held the cup in both hands, letting the steam rise past his face. "A long time ago, before you were born, and for some time after. I knew her well, and the remedy you mentioned, the one that was never collected." "Yes. How do you know about it?" The man took a slow sip of tea. He looked at the shelves around him, at the bottles and jars, and the bundles of dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beams. His gaze moved across the room with the careful attention of someone cataloguing what had changed and what had remained. "Because she wrote to me," he said. "Your mother. She wrote to me in the autumn of 1882, a few weeks before she passed. One letter. The only letter she ever sent me, in all the years. She told me she had prepared something for me, something I would need, though I did not yet know I needed it. She said it would be in the book, and that when I was ready, I should come and ask for it." He set the cup down. "It has taken me 7 years to be ready." Agnes looked at him, looked at the deep lines of his face, at the hands wrapped around the teacup, large hands, weathered, with the particular roughness of someone who had worked outdoors. She looked at his eyes, which were grey, a specific shade of grey that she had seen before in her own mirror every morning of her life. "You are Thomas Ashworth," she said, and the man who was her father, whom she had never met, whom her mother had never spoken of, except in the coded language of a remedy book, closed his eyes and nodded. "I am," he said, "and I am sorry it took me so long. There are facts that one carries through life the way one carries a stone in a pocket, always present, always felt, seldom examined. For Agnes, the stone was this. Her father had left before she was born. He had not been driven away by scandal or financial ruin or any of the dramatic catalysts that populate novels. He had simply left, in the manner of someone who discovers that the life they are living does not correspond to the life they are capable of, and who chooses departure over the slow violence of staying and failing. Eleanor had never spoken of him with bitterness. That was the extraordinary thing. Other women in Thornfield, women whose husbands had merely been late for supper, spoke of male inadequacy with a fluency that suggested long practice. But Eleanor, whose husband had departed entirely, maintained a silence on the subject that was neither angry nor forgiving. It was simply complete, like a door that had been closed and painted over until it became part of the wall. Agnes had grown up in this silence, the way a plant grows in a particular quality of light, shaped by it, adapted to it, unaware that other conditions existed. She had not missed her father, the way a child with memories of a father would miss him. She had missed the idea of him, which was both less painful and more persistent. She had constructed him in her imagination from the available evidence, the few possessions he had left behind, now stored in a box in the attic, a pair of leather gloves, too large for any hand Agnes had ever seen in Thornfield, a compass with a cracked glass face, a book of maps covering the northern counties, with certain routes marked in pencil and annotated in a handwriting she did not recognize, and a single photograph, faded to the color of weak tea, showing a young man standing beside a stone wall with moorland behind him, squinting into sunlight with an expression that might have been happiness or might have been the simple physical response of facing directly into the sun. From these fragments, Agnes had assembled a father. He was a man who walked long distances. He knew north from south, even in fog. He had large hands and did not mind weather. He had stood, at least once, in a place where the light was strong and someone had thought it worth recording. This was enough. It had always been enough. Agnes was not the kind of woman who required complete information to proceed. She was an apothecary, after all. And apothecaries understood that every remedy was, in some fundamental sense, an act of faith, a belief that the correct combination of ingredients, applied at the correct time, in the correct proportion, would produce a change in conditions that could not be entirely predicted or guaranteed. And now here he was, sitting in her still room, drinking her chamomile tea, and she found that the stone she had carried for 30 years was not heavier in his presence, as she might have expected. It was simply different. It had edges now, and texture, and a warmth that came from being held by two people at once, instead of one. The tea had gone cold. Neither of them had noticed. Outside, the rain had settled into the steady, persistent rhythm that Yorkshire rain adopts when it has decided to stay for the duration, and the street lamp on Croft Lane swayed gently in a wind that carried the smell of wet stone and the distant mineral scent of the moors. Thomas set his cup down and looked at his hands. They were resting on the workbench, and in the lamplight they looked like a map of the years he had spent away, calloused and cracked, the nails short and blunt, the knuckles enlarged by decades of work in weather that did not forgive inattention. "I should tell you," he said, "about why I left, if you want to hear it. If you do not, I understand that too. Some stories are better left in the ground." "Tell me," Agnes said. And she said it the way her mother would have said it, without urgency, without demand, simply creating a space into which the words could fall. Thomas nodded. He picked up the teaspoon and turned it slowly between his fingers, a small, repetitive gesture that Agnes recognized from her own habits, the instinct to give the hands something to do, while the mind attempts something difficult. "I was 24 when I came to Thornfield," he began. "I had been walking the northern counties for 2 years, surveying land for a company in Manchester that was interested in railway routes. It was good work for a man who preferred maps to conversations and open ground to enclosed rooms. I was not unhappy. I was not anything in particular. I was simply moving, the way a river moves, because the landscape required it, and because stopping had not yet occurred to me as a possibility." He paused. The teaspoon continued its slow rotation. "Your mother was the first person who made stopping seem like something other than failure. She had a quality, I have never been able to name it properly. A stillness, not passivity, not resignation, but a genuine active stillness, the kind you see in a deep pool where the water is perfectly clear and you can see all the way to the bottom. She was like that. You always knew where you stood with Eleanor, because she had already seen you clearly and decided you were worth her time. We married in the spring of '51. I thought I could stay. I wanted to stay. But wanting and being able are not the same thing, and I had not yet learned the difference. He set the teaspoon down. There is a kind of fear, he said, that does not feel like fear. It feels like restlessness, like a sound you can hear but cannot locate, a vibration in the floor that never quite resolves into an earthquake, but never quite stops either. I carried that fear for months, and I called it by other names: ambition, duty, the need for change. But it was fear. Fear that I would be insufficient. Fear that the man your mother had married was a smaller man than the one she deserved. Fear that if I stayed, she would discover this, and the disappointment would be worse than the absence. So you left, Agnes said. I left. In the December of '51, before you were born. I told myself I was going north for a surveying commission. I told myself I would return in the spring. I told myself many things, all of them plausible, and none of them true. The truth was simpler and uglier than any of the stories I constructed to contain it. I was frightened, and I ran. The lamp flickered. A draught from somewhere. The old building breathing in its sleep. Agnes sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, listening with the fullness of attention that Mrs. Caldwell had once described as her mother's greatest gift. She did not interrupt. She did not soften or redirect. She simply received. The first year was the worst, Thomas continued, not because of the conditions. The borders were hard country, but I was accustomed to hard country. It was the silence, not the silence of the landscape, which was vast and clean and had its own kind of company, but the silence inside me, where your mother's voice had been, where the sounds of a home had been, where the ordinary, unremarkable rhythm of a life shared with another person had been. That silence was not peaceful. It was the silence of a room from which something essential has been removed, and the room keeps waiting for it to be put back. I wrote letters, dozens of them, over the years. I never sent a single one. They're in a box, at the cottage where I live now, tied with a piece of cord that has been retied so many times. The fibers have thinned to almost nothing. Every letter begins the same way. Every letter says the thing I could not say in person. Every letter remains unsent, because I could not determine whether sending it would be an act of courage or an act of cruelty, and the uncertainty paralyzed me more completely than the fear ever had. Agnes thought about this. She thought about the box in the attic, with its compass and its gloves and its photograph. She thought about her mother's remedy book and its patient accumulation of observations, and she thought about the nature of distances, how some distances are measured in miles, and others in years, and others in the space between an intention and its execution. Mother never spoke of you with anger, she said. I used to think that was because she had forgiven you. Now I think it was because she understood you. And understanding is something different from forgiveness, something both more generous and more demanding. Thomas looked at her then, fully, directly, the way a man looks at a mirror when he has been avoiding it for a long time, and has finally decided to see what is there. You sound like her, he said. I know, Agnes replied. It has taken me 30 years to understand, that this is not a coincidence, but an inheritance. Sleep did not come for either of them that night, though both pretended for the other's sake that it had. Agnes lay in her bed and listened to the old building settle around her, the creak of timbers adjusting to the cold, the soft tick of the wall clock in the stairwell, the occasional drip from the gutter outside her window where the rain had found a channel and was following it with the patient persistence of water that has nowhere in particular to be. At 4:30, she gave up the pretense and went downstairs to find Thomas already awake, sitting at the still room window with the remedy book open on his lap, reading by the light of a single candle. He looked up when she entered, but did not speak, and she did not ask what he was reading, because she already knew. The book had a way of directing the reader to the pages they needed, as though Eleanor's handwriting possessed a gravitational pull that varied according to the reader's condition. "Walk?" she asked. He nodded. They went out the back gate, through the walled garden where the frost lay across the herbs like a thin white cloth spread over a table yet to be set, and onto the lane that led up behind the church toward the open moor. The sky was still dark, but it was the particular darkness of a January morning that knows dawn is coming and is beginning, reluctantly, to make room for it. Stars were visible between the clouds, faint and persistent, the way certain truths are visible only when the louder lights have been extinguished. Thornfield, at this hour, was a town held in suspension, no lights in the cottage windows yet, no smoke from the chimneys. The cobblestones gleamed with frost and rainwater, reflecting the street lamps in long distorted ribbons of gold that stretched and contracted with each step. A cat watched them from a windowsill, its eyes two steady points of green in the grey, and did not move as they passed. They walked in silence, which was not uncomfortable. Agnes had learned from her mother that silence between two people could be one of two things, a wall or a room. A wall was the silence of avoidance, of things unspoken because they were too dangerous or too painful to articulate. A room was the silence of companionship, of two people occupying the same space and finding that the space itself was sufficient, that words were welcome but not required. This silence was a room. The lane rose steeply behind the church, passing the stone wall of the cemetery where Eleanor was buried beneath a headstone that Agnes had chosen for its simplicity. Her name, her dates, and a single line that the stonemason had carved with unusual care, as though he understood that the words mattered more than the fee. The line read, "She tended well." Agnes paused at the wall. Thomas paused beside her. Neither spoke. The headstone was not visible from here, not in this darkness, but Agnes knew exactly where it stood. Third row from the yew tree, slightly to the left of the path, because she visited every Sunday morning before opening the shop, bringing whatever was in season: lavender in summer, rosemary in winter, and in the narrow weeks of early spring, the first primroses from the garden wall, which bloomed with the determined cheerfulness of flowers that have survived something difficult and wish to celebrate the fact. They continued upward. The lane gave way to a track, and the track gave way to open moorland, and the moorland stretched out before them in the pre-dawn darkness, like a sea that had chosen, at some ancient moment, to become land instead of water, but had retained the vastness, the emptiness, the quality of horizon that made a person feel simultaneously very small and very free. The wind was stronger here, carrying the smell of wet heather and peat, and the cold, clean mineral scent that Agnes had always associated with the moors, the smell of stone that has been rained on for centuries and has absorbed the rain the way a sponge absorbs water, holding it, releasing it slowly, offering it back to the air in a cycle so old that the stone itself has forgotten when it began. Thomas stopped walking. He stood with his face turned into the wind, his eyes closed, his hands in the pockets of his dark coat, and Agnes watched him and saw, for the first time, the man her mother had loved. Not the young surveyor with his maps and his compass and his fear of insufficiency, but the man underneath, the one who stood in open country with his eyes closed and let the wind tell him what it knew. "I missed this," he said. "The Scottish borders are beautiful, but they are not this. Every landscape has its own language, and this one," he opened his eyes and looked out across the moor, "this one speaks a dialect I have never heard anywhere else. It is the sound of patience, of things that endure without complaint, of ground that does not ask to be admired, but simply continues year after year, being what it is. Mother used to bring me up here," Agnes said, "when I was small. She said the moors were the best place to learn listening, because there was so much to hear, and none of it was trying to be heard." The sky was changing. The darkness along the eastern horizon had thinned to a deep, translucent blue, and below it a band of color was forming. Not gold yet, not truly, but the promise of gold. The way a bud is the promise of a flower. The stars dimmed. The clouds at the horizon's edge caught the first suggestion of light and held it, briefly, before releasing it upward into the broader sky. They watched the dawn arrive. It came slowly, without fanfare, in the manner of all Yorkshire dawns, not the theatrical sunrise of warmer climates, but a gradual, considered illumination, as though the sky were thinking carefully about how much light to offer, and had decided, as it did most January mornings, that enough was sufficient, and more would be excessive. The moor revealed itself in stages. First the nearest heather, grey-brown and frost-tipped, then the shallow valley below, with its thread of stream catching the new light like a vein of silver in dark rock. Then the far hills, emerging from the darkness like memories surfacing from sleep, indistinct at first, then sharpening, then settling into the familiar shapes that Agnes had known her entire life, and that Thomas was seeing again for the first time in 37 years. "It has not changed," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not surprise exactly, but recognition. The recognition that comes when you return to a place you have carried inside you and discover that the internal version was accurate. That memory, for once, had not lied. "The moors do not change," Agnes said. "That is their gift and their challenge. They simply wait for you to come back to them." They read the remedy book together. This was Agnes's suggestion, offered not out of generosity but out of the practical recognition that a shared text requires less explanation than a retold one, and that the truth, whatever it turned out to be, would be better served by her mother's words than by her own or his. She turned to the last entry, Thomas Ashworth, November the 3rd, 1882, and there, in Eleanor's small, precise handwriting, the remedy that had waited 7 years for its intended recipient. It was not a recipe for a tincture or a salve or a draught. It was a list of observations dated across 30 years, beginning in the spring of 1852, the year Thomas had left, and ending in the autumn of 1882, 3 weeks before Eleanor's death. Each entry was brief, no more than a line or two, and each recorded something small, something Agnes had done, or said, or become. Spring, 1852. She arrived today, 7 pounds and 4 ounces. She has his hands, autumn 1855. She identified the lavender by smell alone. 3 years old. She was not taught. She simply knew. Winter 1861. She read the entire chapter on respiratory ailments and corrected 2 of my dosages. She was 10. She was right. Summer 1867. A boy from the grammar school came to the shop. She served him without looking up from the book. She will not be easily distracted from things that matter. Spring 1873. She prepared the elderflower cordial for the first time without supervision. It was better than mine. I did not tell her this. I should have. Autumn 1878. Mrs. Caldwell's daughter came to the shop in distress. Agnes sat with her for an hour. She did not offer advice or remedy. She simply listened. She has understood something I tried for 30 years to teach by example, that sometimes the most powerful remedy is the willingness to be present. Winter 1882. She does not know yet what this book contains. She will find it when she is ready. Everything arrives in its season, and she has always been her own season, unhurried and precise, like the first frost. Agnes read these entries, one by one, in the lamplight of the still room, while the rain continued its quiet work against the windows, and the clock on the mantel marked the hours with a patience that matched her own. And beside each entry, she now noticed what she had missed in all her previous readings. A second column, written in a different ink, fainter, as though added later or in haste. Each second column contained a single word or phrase, and each phrase was a remedy. Not for Agnes, for Thomas. She has his hands. Remedy. Know that you left something good behind. She identified the lavender. Remedy. Know that what you carried she carries too, and it is not a burden but a gift. She corrected my dosages. Remedy. Know that your absence did not diminish her. Nothing could. She simply listened. Remedy. Know that the quality you feared was weakness, the tendency to feel too much, to hear what is unspoken, became, in your daughter, a strength. It was never weakness, not in her, not in you. Agnes closed the book. She did not close it abruptly or with force. She closed it the way one closes a door behind a guest who has delivered news that will take a long time to fully understand. Gently, completely, and with the knowledge that the door would need to be opened again. She looked at her father. He was weeping, silently, in the manner of a man for whom tears are not a frequent occurrence, and therefore arrive without the usual courtesies of sound. They simply fell, tracing the deep lines of his face like rain, finding the grooves in old stone. She knew you would come, Agnes said. She always knew more than she said. Yes, that was her particular talent. Thomas slept in the chair. Agnes had offered the small bedroom above the shop, but he had declined with a shake of his head that contained more wariness than refusal, and by the time she returned with a blanket, he was already asleep, his head tilted back, his large hands folded across his chest, his breathing deep and steady. Agnes watched him for a moment. Then she draped the blanket across him and went upstairs, where she lay in her own bed and listened to the rain, and did not sleep and did not mind not sleeping, because some nights are not for sleep. Some nights are for holding a new understanding and turning it slowly in the dark, the way one turns a prism, watching the light change with each angle. She rose at 5:30, as she always did. The rain had stopped. The sky through the bedroom window was the color of diluted ink, that peculiar pre-dawn gray that promises nothing about the day to come, except that it will eventually come. She went downstairs. Thomas was awake, standing at the still-room window, looking out at the walled garden. The lavender was dormant in its winter aspect, reduced to grey-green mounds that bore little resemblance to the fragrant abundance of summer. But the rosemary was green, as rosemary always was, stubbornly vital even in January, and the frost on its needle-like leaves caught the first tentative light and held it, briefly, like a small and private celebration. "She planted all of this?" Thomas asked without turning. "Most of it. I have added a few things over the years, the comfrey in the far corner, the lemon balm by the wall, though I sometimes regret that decision. It has ambitions well beyond its allocated space." Thomas smiled. It was a small smile, uncertain of its welcome, like the first crocus of spring appearing through frozen ground. "She always said lemon balm was the most optimistic plant in the garden. It assumed every surface was an invitation. She said that to you. Many things, a long time ago, when we were both still young enough to believe that understanding a thing was the same as knowing what to do about it." Agnes made breakfast. Porridge with honey, because it was January, and January demanded porridge, and because the honey came from Mr. Thornton's bees on the moor, and tasted of heather and distance and all the things that Yorkshire kept in its soil and released slowly into everything that grew from it. They ate in the still room, with the remedy book between them, closed now but present in the way that a book that has just been read remains present, its words still reverberating, still settling into the spaces they would eventually occupy in the reader's understanding. At 8:30, Agnes opened the shop. The bell made its muffled announcement. The street outside was wet and grey and ordinary, and the first customer of the day was Mrs. Caldwell, who came every Tuesday for her rheumatism preparation, and stayed invariably for 20 minutes of conversation that ranged across every topic in Thornfield, except the one Mrs. Caldwell actually wished to discuss, which was her loneliness. Agnes served her with the same patience she brought to every encounter. She measured the tincture, she listened, she asked about the cat, which was Mrs. Caldwell's primary companion, and therefore a subject of inexhaustible interest. And when Mrs. Caldwell paused in her account of the cat's latest adventure with a mouse, a narrative that had, by Agnes's count, been told 4 times with increasing embellishment, Agnes said, quite gently, "Mrs. Caldwell, did you know my mother well?" Caldwell looked at her with the sharp attention of someone who has been waiting for a question and has finally been asked it. "Better than most," she said. "Why do you ask?" "Because I have been reading her book, the second half of it, and I believe she was doing something I did not fully understand until last night." Mrs. Caldwell set down her bottle of tincture. She placed both hands flat on the counter, a gesture Agnes recognized as the physical equivalent of clearing one's throat before saying something important. "Your mother," she said, "was the finest listener I have ever known. She did not simply hear what people said. She heard what they could not say, and then she found ways to give them what they needed without them ever knowing it had been given. The remedies," Agnes said, "not the ones in the bottles, dear. The other ones. The ones she wrote in the book. A word to the vicar about a family that needed visiting. A suggestion to the schoolmaster that a particular child might benefit from extra attention. A recipe shared with a young wife who had not yet learned to cook, and was too proud to admit it. Small things, invisible things, but they added up, over the years, to something quite extraordinary. She was treating the town," Agnes said, and the realization landed in her chest with the weight of something that had been falling for a very long time. "She was tending it," Mrs. Caldwell corrected gently. The way one tends a garden, not by forcing things to grow, but by understanding what each thing needed and providing it quietly and trusting that the growing would happen on its own. Agnes returned to the still room after the shop closed that evening. Thomas was still there, reading the remedy book from the beginning. Slowly, the way one reads a letter that has been delayed by decades. She sat across from him and watched the lamplight move across the pages, across her mother's handwriting, across the accumulation of a lifetime's attention and care, and she understood, at last, what the last remedy was. It was not for Thomas alone. It was for both of them. Eleanor had known she was dying. The final entries in the book made that clear, though she had never spoken of it to Agnes. Another silence, another door painted over, though this one, Agnes now understood, had been painted not to conceal, but to protect. Eleanor had spent her last weeks not in fear or sorrow, but in the patient, methodical work of preparing the shop for Agnes to inherit, preparing the garden for the winter it would spend without her, and preparing the book, the second half of the book, for the two people who would need it most. The remedy for Thomas was the list of everything he had missed, delivered not as accusation, but as evidence. Evidence that his departure had not destroyed what he feared it would destroy, that the daughter he had left behind was whole and capable, and possessed of gifts he had not dared to hope she might inherit. The remedy was forgiveness, dispensed in the only form Eleanor believed in, not as absolution, which required authority she did not claim, but as information, which required only accuracy and compassion. And the remedy for Agnes, the one Eleanor had never labeled, because it was woven into the fabric of the entire book rather than contained in any single entry, was understanding. Understanding that her mother's silence about Thomas had not been secrecy, but patience. Understanding that some remedies cannot be administered by the person who prepares them, but must be left on a shelf, carefully labeled, until the patient is ready to collect them. Understanding that 7 years, or 30, or a lifetime, was not too long to wait for the right moment, because the right moment, like the right remedy, was not a matter of timing but of readiness. Agnes opened the book to the final page. Below the last entry, below the date and the name, and the remedy that had waited 7 years, there was a line she had read before, but never understood. A line written in Eleanor's steadiest hand, the script of a woman who knew exactly what she was writing and why. It said, "The last remedy is always the same. It is the willingness to begin again." Thomas stayed in Thornfield for a week. He slept in the small room above the shop, and each morning he came downstairs to find Agnes already at work in the still room, measuring and mixing and recording in a new notebook she had purchased from the stationer on the high street. They did not speak of the lost years with the urgency of people trying to recover something stolen. They spoke instead in the manner of two people building something new, carefully, the way one might rebuild a wall, one stone at a time, checking each one for fit before reaching for the next. Thomas told her about his life. He had gone north, to the Scottish borders, where he had worked as a shepherd for 11 years, and then as a forester for another 12. He had lived alone, not because he preferred solitude, but because he had not trusted himself with the alternative. He had carried the letter from Eleanor for 7 years, reading it once a month, always on the 3rd of November, the date it was written. Each reading he came a little closer to doing what it asked, and each year the distance between Thornfield and the place where he lived grew a little smaller, until finally it was small enough to cross. He described the pine forests of the borders, the way the light came through the canopy in the early morning, like water through a sieve, falling in columns of gold onto the forest floor, where the fallen needles lay in a carpet so thick that every footstep was silent. He described the deer that stood at the edge of clearings at dusk, watching him with eyes that held no fear, because they had learned that this particular man moved slowly and meant no harm. He described the winters, which were longer and darker than Yorkshire winters, but possessed a different quality of cold, a dry, still cold that did not seep through walls the way the damp Yorkshire cold did, but lay across the landscape like a held breath, waiting for the release of spring. Agnes listened to all of it. She listened the way she listened to patients in the shop, not just to the words, but to the spaces between them, to the hesitations, to the places where his voice changed pitch or his hands moved differently, because these were the symptoms, the indicators, the small diagnostic signs that told a careful observer what the patient truly needed, which was rarely the thing they had come in asking for. What Thomas needed, she determined, was not forgiveness, or absolution, or even understanding, though he received all three. What he needed was to be witnessed, to have someone sit across from him and see the full scope of the life he had lived in exile, and not turn away from it, not diminish it, not explain it, but simply acknowledge it the way one acknowledges a landscape, entirely, without judgment, with the quiet recognition that it is what it is, because of everything that has happened to it. Agnes told him about the apothecary, about the patients, and the preparations and the garden that refused to stay within its walls, about Mrs. Caldwell and her cat, about the boy from the grammar school who had grown into a man and now ran the ironmonger's and still came to the shop, though he no longer pretended to need cough syrup, about the moors in autumn, and the heather turned the hills the color of old wine, and the air tasted of rain that had not yet fallen. She told him about the winters when the pipes froze, and she learned to thaw them with hot cloths and patience, about the summer when the garden produced so much lemon balm that she gave bundles of it to every household on Croft Lane, and the entire street smelled of citrus for a fortnight, about the night old Mr. Thornton's grandson was born 3 weeks early, and she sat with the family until dawn, preparing raspberry leaf tea and speaking in the steady, unhurried voice that her mother had used in every crisis, the voice that said, without saying it, that difficulty was temporary, and the human body was wiser than the human mind, and most things given time and warmth and attention would resolve themselves. On the last evening of his visit, they sat together in the still room. The fire was low. The lamp cast its familiar amber pool. The remedy book lay on the shelf where it had always been, closed but not finished, because a book that contains the record of a life's attention is never truly finished. It simply waits for the next hand to open it. Agnes had begun her own book. She had started it that morning, on the first blank page of the new notebook, with a pen her mother had used, and an ink that smelled of iron and tannin, and the slow, dark patience of oak galls. The first entry was dated January the 14th, 1889, and it read, Thomas Ashworth returned today. He came at midnight in the rain, and asked for a remedy that was prepared 7 years ago. The remedy was not a tincture. It was the truth. He stayed for a week and told me about the Scottish borders and the quality of silence in a pine forest at dawn. He has my hands, or rather, I have his. I did not know this until I watched him hold a teacup. Remedy. Begin. Thomas left the next morning. He did not say goodbye in the manner of someone leaving permanently. He said it in the manner of someone who now knew the way and intended to use it again. At the door he paused and reached into the pocket of his dark coat and produced something small, which he placed on the counter beside the bell with its strip of felt. It was his compass, not the one with the cracked glass that sat in the attic box, but a new one, well used but well maintained, its brass case warm from his pocket. "For your travels," he said. And then, seeing Agnes's expression, "Not all journeys require leaving home. Some of the longest ones happen in a single room, over the course of a single night, with a book and a lamp and a willingness to read what was always there." Agnes took the compass. She held it in her palm, feeling its weight, its warmth, the particular solidity of an object that has been carried by someone for a long time and has absorbed something of their character. The needle turned, found north, and held. She stood at the door and watched him walk down Croft Lane in the pale January light, his dark coat growing smaller with distance, his breath rising in clouds that dissipated and reformed and dissipated again, the way all things that are released into the air eventually return in different form. She went back inside. She placed the compass on the shelf beside the remedy book. Then she opened the shop. The bell made its muffled sound. The first customer of the day was a young woman she did not recognize, holding a baby wrapped in a wool shawl, asking in a hesitant voice if there was anything for infant colic. Agnes looked at the young woman. She looked at the baby, whose small fist had found its way free of the shawl and was grasping at the air with the determined imprecision of someone who has only recently discovered that they have hands. She looked at the shelves behind her, where 38 years of remedies stood in their patient rows, waiting for the hands that would choose them and the hands that would receive them. "Yes," she said, "there is. Come in." And now, dear listener, the story is over and the apothecary is quiet. The lamp on the workbench has been turned down. The shelves stand in the soft darkness, their bottles holding their patient remedies, their labels unreadable now in the low light, and that is all right. The remedies know their own names. They do not need to be read to know what they are. The fire in the still room has burned to embers, a faint glow, amber and red, the last warmth of the evening settling into the stones. The garden beyond the window is dark and still. The rosemary holds its frost. The lavender sleeps beneath the soil, waiting for the season that will call it back. Let your breathing slow now. Let each breath be a little longer, a little deeper, a little more willing to let go. The town of Thornfield is sleeping. The street lamps on Croft Lane burn low, their gaslight reduced to small, steady stars in the winter dark. The church tower stands against the sky, patient and familiar. Somewhere a door closes softly. Somewhere a clock chimes an hour that no one is awake to count. You are warm. You are safe. You are held by the same gentle darkness that holds the town, the apothecary, the garden, the moors beyond. Let your thoughts slow now. If they drift, let them drift. The way smoke drifts from a chimney on a windless night, rising slowly, dissolving softly, becoming part of the larger darkness without effort or resistance. You do not need to hold anything tonight. Not the story, not its meaning, not the names or the places or the remedies. They will be here if you want them. They will keep. Everything keeps in its own time, in its own way. The last remedy is always the same. It is rest. It is stillness. It is the willingness to close your eyes and trust that the morning will come and that it will be enough. Sleep now. Rest well. Good night.